Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Social media movements in discourse analysis. Social media movements are collective actions and campaigns that emerge and evolve through online platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. These movements often seek to raise awareness about social, political, or cultural issues, challenge dominant narratives, and mobilize public opinion. Discourse analysis of social media movements explores how language, hashtags, images, and other forms of communication are used to construct identities, frame issues, and generate solidarity among participants. It also reveals how these movements engage with power structures, reflect societal values, and shape public discourse. Through social media, movements gain traction rapidly and reach wide audiences, allowing marginalized voices to participate and influence the conversation. Discourse analysis helps uncover the strategies used by these movements to challenge dominant ideologies, reframe societal narratives, and promote change. Key features of social media movements in discourse analysis. Point 1. Hashtags as discursive tools. Hashtags serve as powerful discursive tools in social media movements, functioning as both organizational and rhetorical devices. They help to frame issues, unify participants around a cause, and increase the visibility of movements. Hashtags allow movements to create a shared language that resonates with participants and communicates clear messages to a broader audience. Example: the hashtag #MeToo became a global movement that brought attention to sexual harassment and assault. The simplicity of the hashtag allowed people to share their experiences, while the use of #MeToo created a sense of collective identity and solidarity. Discourse analysis of the #MeToo movement would explore how the hashtag frames the issue of sexual violence and enables individuals to align themselves with the movement through personal narratives. Point 2. Viral spread and amplification. Social media movements often rely on the viral spread of content, where posts, images, or videos are rapidly shared and amplified across platforms. This process helps movements gain momentum and draw attention to issues that might be overlooked in mainstream media. Discourse analysis can examine how language and multimodal content, images, videos, memes, contribute to the viral spread and shape the movement's message. Example: the viral spread of #Black Lives Matter after the killing of George Floyd in 2020 highlighted how social media movements can quickly draw global attention to issues of racial injustice. Discourse analysis of the movement would focus on how hashtags, videos of protests, and images of police violence were shared to amplify the movement's message and generate international solidarity. Point 3. Challenging dominant narratives. Social media movements often emerge to challenge dominant narratives that marginalize certain groups or issues. By analyzing the language used in these movements, discourse analysts can uncover how activists use social media to subvert mainstream discourses, offer alternative perspectives, and promote social justice. Example: the #SayHerName movement challenges the dominant narrative around police brutality by drawing attention to the stories of Black women who are often overlooked in broader discussions of racial violence. Discourse analysis of #SayHerName would explore how the movement reframes the conversation about police violence to include gendered experiences of injustice, emphasizing the importance of intersectionality. Point 4. Identity construction and solidarity. Social media movements create spaces for identity construction and the formation of collective identities. Through shared language, hashtags, and personal stories, participants align themselves with the movement's goals and values, creating a sense of belonging and solidarity. Discourse analysis can reveal how language and online interaction contribute to the construction of these collective identities. Example: in the #Climate Strike movement, young activists use language to construct their identity as climate warriors or youth leaders, positioning themselves as defenders of the environment and challengers of governmental inaction. Discourse analysis would examine how hashtags, protest slogans, and social media posts reflect the movement's values of environmentalism and intergenerational responsibility, while also building a collective identity around youth-led activism. Point 5. Multimodal communication. Social media movements often use a combination of text, images, videos, memes, and infographics to communicate their messages. Multimodal discourse analysis explores how these different modes of communication work together to shape public understanding of the movement and its goals. It also reveals how movements leverage visuals and multimedia to make their messages more compelling and accessible. Example: the hashtag Fridays for Future movement, initiated by climate activist Greta Thunberg, uses powerful images of youth protests, graphs illustrating climate data, and infographics on environmental policy to mobilize public support for climate action. Discourse analysis of the movement would examine how these multimodal elements reinforce the urgency of the climate crisis and engage diverse audiences across social media platforms. Point 6. Counter-discourses and backlash. Social media movements often face counter-discourses that oppose or attempt to undermine their messages. Discourse analysis examines how these counter-discourses are constructed and how movements respond to backlash. Analyzing both sides of the discourse provides insight into the ideological struggles that occur on social media platforms. Example: the hashtag #AllLivesMatter hashtag emerged as a counter-discourse to hashtag Black Lives Matter, attempting to shift the conversation from the specific issue of anti-black racism to a more generalized focus on equality. Discourse analysis of these two movements would explore how hashtag Black Lives Matter emphasizes systemic racism and the unique challenges faced by black communities, while hashtag #AllLivesMatter dilutes that focus, revealing the ideological tensions between the two discourses. Methods for analyzing social media movements in discourse analysis. Point 1. Hashtag analysis. Hashtag analysis is a central method for studying social media movements, as hashtags often serve as rallying points for activism. By examining the use of hashtags, discourse analysts can trace how movements organize online, how they frame their goals, and how hashtags contribute to collective identity and solidarity. Example: in the hashtag #MeToo movement, hashtag analysis would focus on how different users adopt the hashtag to share their personal experiences of sexual harassment and assault. This analysis would reveal how the hashtag created a sense of shared struggle, connecting individuals across geographical and cultural boundaries. Point 2. Multimodal discourse analysis. Multimodal discourse analysis explores how social media movements use different forms of communication, text, visuals, videos, and sound, to convey messages. This method is particularly useful in social media movements, where communication is often highly visual and interactive. Example: in the hashtag Climate Strike movement, multimodal analysis would examine how protest photos, climate infographics, and videos of youth activists speaking at global forums contribute to the movement's impact. It would also explore how these modes of communication interact with text-based posts to create a cohesive and persuasive message about the climate crisis. Point 3. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, is used to uncover the power dynamics and ideologies embedded in the language of social media movements. It examines how movements challenge dominant power structures and how language reflects broader social and political struggles. Example: a CDA of hashtag Black Lives Matter would explore how the movement challenges institutional racism and police brutality, using language that emphasizes systemic inequality and the need for justice. It would also examine how the movement reclaims language to empower black communities and counter negative stereotypes perpetuated by mainstream media. Point 4. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis examines the stories that emerge within social media movements and how these stories help construct the movement's identity and values. By analyzing individual posts and collective narratives, discourse analysts can reveal how movements use personal experiences to build emotional connections and drive social change. Example: in the hashtag #MeToo movement, narrative analysis would focus on the personal stories of survivors shared under the hashtag. It would explore how these narratives create a collective testimony that challenges the normalization of sexual harassment and amplifies the voices of survivors, thereby shaping the public discourse around gender and power. Examples of social media movements in discourse analysis. Example 1. Hashtag #MeToo movement. The hashtag #MeToo movement began as a grassroots campaign against sexual harassment and quickly became a global phenomenon. Discourse analysis of hashtag #MeToo would focus on how survivors of sexual violence used the hashtag to share their stories, creating a collective narrative that highlighted the pervasive nature of the problem. The analysis might explore how language like survivor and silence breakers reframed societal perceptions of victims, shifting the discourse from one of shame and silence to one of empowerment and solidarity. Example 2. Black Lives Matter. The hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, founded in response to police violence against Black people, has used social media to raise awareness about racial injustice. Discourse analysis of hashtag Black Lives Matter would examine how the movement constructs a narrative of resistance and solidarity through language that emphasizes systemic inequality. It would also explore how hashtags like hashtag say their names honor victims of police brutality, turning their names into symbols of the movement and amplifying calls for justice. Example 3. Fridays for Future. The hashtag Fridays for Future movement, led by young climate activists, has used social media to organize global climate strikes and raise awareness about environmental issues. Discourse analysis would focus on how the movement uses hashtags like hashtag climate strike and hashtag act now to mobilize youth around the world. The analysis would also examine how the movement frames climate change as an urgent, generational crisis, using language that calls for immediate action and highlights the responsibility of governments and corporations. Example 4. Arab Spring. The hashtag Arab Spring movement, which began in 2010, used social media to mobilize protests across the Arab world, challenging authoritarian regimes and calling for political reform. Discourse analysis of the movement would focus on how social media platforms facilitated the spread of protest messages and built solidarity among protesters. It would also explore how hashtags like hashtag Tahrir Square became symbols of resistance and how the language of the movement reflected the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. Challenges in analyzing social media movements through discourse. Point 1. Ephemerality of social media. Social media content is often fleeting, with posts quickly disappearing from newsfeeds or being deleted. This can make it difficult for discourse analysts to capture the full scope of a movement's communication, especially if key messages or moments are lost over time. Point 2. Multivocality and fragmentation. Social media movements are often multivocal, with diverse participants contributing different perspectives and messages. This can make it challenging to identify a unified discourse, as movements are not always cohesive or centralized. Discourse analysts must navigate the diversity of voices to understand the broader narrative. Point 3. Platform-specific norms. Each social media platform has its own communication norms, such as character limits on Twitter or visual emphasis on Instagram. These norms shape how movements communicate, which can limit certain types of discourse. Analyzing how movements adapt their messaging across platforms adds complexity to discourse analysis. Conclusion. Social media movements have transformed the way collective action is organized and communicated, offering new opportunities for marginalized voices to influence public discourse. Through discourse analysis, researchers can uncover how these movements use language, hashtags, and multimodal content to challenge dominant ideologies, frame issues, and build solidarity. Whether through movements like hashtag #MeToo, hashtag Black Lives Matter, or hashtag Fridays for Future, social media has become a powerful tool for activism, allowing participants to rapidly spread their message and engage global audiences. By analyzing the discursive strategies used in these movements, discourse analysts can provide deeper insights into how social media is reshaping public discourse and driving social change. Frequently asked questions. What are social media movements in discourse analysis? Social media movements refer to collective actions and campaigns that emerge and evolve on online platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Discourse analysis examines how language, hashtags, and multimedia content are used to mobilize, challenge dominant narratives, and influence public opinion in these movements. How do hashtags function in social media movements? Hashtags are discursive tools that help organize and unify participants around a cause. They frame issues, create collective identities, and increase the visibility of movements, serving as a rallying point for activism in social media discourse. How do social media movements achieve viral spread? Social media movements spread virally when posts, videos, or images are rapidly shared, drawing widespread attention. Discourse analysis examines how language and multimodal content contribute to the rapid amplification of these movements and shape public understanding. How do social media movements challenge dominant narratives? Social media movements often emerge to contest mainstream discourses, offering alternative perspectives and challenging dominant societal narratives. Discourse analysis uncovers how activists use language to critique existing power structures and promote social justice. How are identity and solidarity constructed in social media movements? Through shared language, personal stories, and hashtags, participants in social media movements construct collective identities. Discourse analysis explores how these linguistic elements help build solidarity and foster a sense of belonging among participants. What role does multimodal communication play in social media movements? Social media movements use a combination of text, images, videos, and infographics to convey messages. Multimodal discourse analysis looks at how these different forms of communication interact to create compelling and accessible messages for diverse audiences. How are counter-discourses and backlash handled in social media movements? Social media movements often face opposing discourses that challenge their narratives. Discourse analysis examines how these counter-discourses are constructed and how movements respond to criticism, providing insights into the ideological struggles on social media platforms. What methods are used to analyze social media movements? Methods like hashtag analysis, multimodal discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, CDA, and narrative analysis are used to study how movements organize, communicate, and challenge dominant ideologies through language and online interaction. How do social media movements adapt their messaging across platforms? Each social media platform has unique communication norms, which influence how movements craft their messages. Discourse analysis examines how movements adapt their language and strategies to fit the specific features and user expectations of platforms like Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. What challenges arise in analyzing social media movements? Challenges include the ephemerality of social media content, the multivocality and fragmentation of movements, and the need to account for platform-specific communication norms. These factors complicate the analysis of how movements sustain their messages and engage with different audiences.